Welcome to the Retail Focus Podcast, a weekly collection of news, interviews, and information from the world of retail. Here are your hosts, Trent Kling and Leighton Kling.
Welcome to this edition of the Retail Focus Podcast. I'm Trent Kling. He's Leighton Kling. Coming up on today's show, well, it's more of the same with coronavirus and COVID-19 news stories changing by the hour. So we're going to keep it, again, a little bit more general today, but we're going to hone in on a few stories that certainly caught our radar during the last week. Quick update just on the show because of what's going on in retail, because of coronavirus. We're going to maybe alter the scope of the show a little bit going forward just for the next little while. It might be a little bit more interview driven. We've got a few interviews lined up on how retailers are coping with the impacts, on what some are doing to shift around their sales surrounding coronavirus impacts. So we'll feature those interviews. We'll also sprinkle in news a little bit more. And with both of us primarily being stuck at home all day, you might have a few more episodes sprinkled in as well. So that's kind of what we're looking at here, at least over the next 4 to 6 weeks, or maybe longer, depending on how long this lingers over the U.S. landscape. A reminder, you can like us and rate us however you do access us, whether that be on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, on Blueberry, or Podcast Addict, any one of those. It certainly does help out. You can check us out on social media as well, at Retail Podcast. Well, the first story we wanted to cover today, we got some limited insight this week on consumer trends in what's become a vastly different retail landscape. The landscape we know right now is nothing like what we knew 6 weeks ago. And Leighton, this is really a circumstance where things are changing so rapidly, and it's yet to be seen exactly how people are going to approach money during this time.
That's right, Trent. People are going to approach money, their own personal financial situation, in varying ways, as you can imagine, across many different demographics, across many different populations throughout the United States. People are going to have their own set of rules on how to spend during this very, very nuanced time. They could hoard the money and spend when the rules are relaxed towards non-essential retailers. They could hoard the money and not spend it all with worry surrounding the economy and the immediate to midterm future of said economy. They could choose to not hoard money and spend surrounding different items or in different ways, such as through e-commerce avenues that they were not likely to spend in previously. So think of clothing for one. Or there could be no money to spend at all, with layoffs and furloughs increasingly likely, and we'll talk more on that a little bit later. But a lot of companies you see announcing furloughs. I know GM, I know Textron, Trent, has announced a number of furloughs throughout the country, thousands of people being affected, and typically you'll see a trickle-down effect. Not necessarily immediately because, of course, we have people buying a lot of groceries and other retail goods, but maybe in the short to midterm as those furloughs and layoffs actually take place within the next few weeks or months. However, bit by bit, we are starting to get some information on specific spend trends. Walmart's Executive Vice President of Corporate Affairs, Dan Bartlett, said late last week that they are seeing surprising momentum towards clothing, but not all clothing. In fact, people are increasingly buying tops, a fact attributed to maybe the increase in video conferencing as more people, in fact, are working from home. Remote work is now a thing, folks. So a lot of people are buying more tops for that particular activity. It will be interesting to see generally if the work from home momentum continues into the non-COVID-19 future, as workplaces have seen varying levels of productivity as a result of all this work from home. A lot of different studies, Trent, that I like to study and look through prior to this COVID-19, saying that typically you'll see that morale is up when people are working from home, but productivity could either be the same, so neutral, or slightly lower, or slightly higher, depending on, of course, which study you look at. However, to credit video conferencing for this apparel increase only tells part of the story from this retail perspective. Indeed, Walmart, Target, Dollar General, and Family Dollar, Dollar General's competitor there, are among the retailers who are almost universally open while still offering clothing. So count Meijer maybe and Kroger Marketplace in that group as well. Meanwhile, most department stores such as Kohl's, JCPenney, and Macy's have long shuttered by most state and local government mandates. This may provide each retailer's clothing line with the unprecedented ability to stand out in the brick and mortar space, something they've rarely had in the past, really not had a chance to do. Just eerie looking at all those department stores that are now closed, especially in those very large conventional malls near where I live. And Trent, I was recently in an Arkansas Family Dollar, and they had a greater than average clothing selection among all of their sold out paper goods and groceries, of course, as well. But it will be interesting to see if Dollar General and Family Dollar mention clothing as a potential area of growth during this quarter. So a lot of focus is going to be on maybe some sectors within the dollar space that we typically don't see. But going back to Walmart, Trent, Bartlett did note that the sales mix is varying by state based on different orders in place. E-commerce product mix is not the same as brick and mortar for their customers. However, pretty well universally, they are seeing a run on cleaning and sanitizing supplies and, of course, paper products. Not a huge surprise there, but some merchandise that is not typically top of mind is also being given the spotlight, with traffic higher surrounding DVDs. That's right, not Blu-rays, not those modern discs, but DVDs, in fact. Also, they've sold a metric ton of crafting items, people staying at home knitting for the first time maybe in their lives, while maybe in between ukulele breaks. But Bartlett gave popsicle sticks also as an example, where they'd sold 30 million since the onset of COVID in the United States. And the NPD group released more macro level data for recent shopping trends today.
They did, although ukulele sales was not among the shopping trends that they noted. One of the more interesting numbers the NPD group came out with is the 8% jump in small appliance sales during mid-March. This was attributed by NPD group to the fact that people are not going out to eat, so it makes sense. As such, they're stocking up on kitchen gadgets they probably didn't have or didn't use before, hadn't even thought of using before. Leighton mentioned people taking up crafts that maybe they haven't done before. A lot of families, and I think a number of families that people don't really recognize on the whole, do tend to eat at restaurants, whether they be QSRs, fast casuals, or even the sit-down places, just the normal casual restaurants. Right now, that business is going to grocery stores. But of course, you need something to turn the raw food from grocery stores into an edible meal. In most cases, you're just not eating raw carrots for dinner. And so you're seeing this jump in kitchen gadgets, in small appliance sales. And I think it was interesting because they mentioned specifically bread makers seeing a jump. And this is understandable because we've heard from multiple bakery chains about their fight to keep stores stocked with a good in bread that is perishable. So they're working hard, but again, it's always so difficult when you work in, for example, the bakery space, making sure you don't overbake. It's the same thing for those store bakeries, the in-store bakeries you might see when you go to a Safeway or a Kroger or a Walmart. But flour still seems to be plentiful based on what we're hearing, based on what I know Leighton has seen. I haven't actually made it out of the house for a good little while other than to hike, but again, flour still plentiful. So people saying, hey, we're going to make our own bread now. We have a little bit more time on our hands. We can tinker around with a few recipes and the like. You're also seeing electric skillets, sandwich makers, even pasta makers, which I found surprising. But again, if you have more time on your hands, you're probably going to find ways to use that in the kitchen. Juicers and rice cookers, also products all in the same boat, according to the NPD. And this was actually echoed on Brian Cornell's media call last week. Of course, Cornell, for those that listen to the podcast regularly, the CEO of Target, they've seen an uptick in movements around kitchen gadgets as well. And Target is uniquely positioned to benefit from this because if you go to a Walmart, yes, there are kitchen gadgets, there are other things around the store there. But the way Target merchandises their kitchen gadgets and also the way in which their buyers have placed kitchen gadgets strategically into the stores by purchasing up-and-coming products, I think Target is going to be the brand or the retailer that will benefit from that the most going forward. Now, one thing that's been mentioned by multiple retailers the potential coronavirus stimulus checks and how those might be a boon to grocers and general merchandise retailers. Now, we'll talk about the potential small retail business implications from the CARES Act later on in the show, but of all the chains we've mentioned, they all stand to benefit, along with Albertsons and regional grocers. They all stand to maybe capture a share of whatever it happens to be. A lot of people seeming to think that you're going to see probably a median amount of about $1,000 to $1,200 in those stimulus checks. However, it is going to be up to these retailers to change along with these shifting consumer preferences. And these consumer preferences are shifting in a way we've never seen before. Leighton, you and I have talked about it via text message a lot during the past week. One day, one thing is popular and sold out of stores. The next day, another thing is popular and sold out of stores. I know, for example, around here in Colorado where I live, dog food is beginning to sell out of a lot of stores. And so those buyers really have their work cut out for them to figure out that next move, because macro level preferences are shifting by the day. So when people get one need taken care of, the paper products, the hand sanitizer, the soap, they move on to something different. So beyond just the milk and bread, now we're seeing, as we mentioned, kitchen gadgets. Now we're seeing other things. We're even seeing, and I dare anyone to go out there and try this, but as of when we're recording the podcast, you cannot find a 500 to 1,000 piece jigsaw puzzle on Amazon Prime for Prime shipping. You just can't do it. Everything is sold out. Walmart's sold out of a lot of their puzzles. People are trying to find ways, trying to pick up hobbies, trying to do things to kill time that they've never done before. And so if you're a buyer, a month ago, 2 months ago, jigsaw puzzles were the furthest thing from your mind. And now there's a bit of a mini rush, a nature rush, if you will, on those jigsaw puzzles. So just something to keep in mind over the next couple of months is, how are those buyers going to react? For some retailers like Home Depot and Lowe's and Tractor Supply Company may not be affected all that much. With grocers, but especially general merchandise retailers, very important for them to stay on top of things.
Well, Trent, I mentioned it in our previous story, but more layoffs and furloughs hit the retail world this week, particularly for retailers who have been shut down for increased lengths of time. And anytime you see this sort of shutdown for weeks and potentially months for any retailer, you're thinking immediately cash flow. You're thinking the accounting department, finance. What are the repercussions of not having any revenue coming in? What does that mean as far as your credit is concerned? And what does that mean for paying employees? And what cuts are you going to have to make with the long-term sustainability of your business in mind? And just today, we got word that Ascena, Macy's, Gap, and Kohl's will all be furloughing employees. One interesting thing to keep in mind, and we know restaurants are furloughing and laying off, but what are those restaurant suppliers going to be doing in the supply chain? And look no further than the food supply chain giant Sysco, who announced furloughs this week. Enter Kroger, who smartly swooped in and reached an interesting deal with Sysco. Sysco, of course, being one of the most massive suppliers for restaurants within the full service and quick service food industry. Per the company agreement, Sysco's furloughed employees will be allowed to temporarily get jobs at Kroger distribution centers if they so choose. Of course, this deal is somewhat limited geographically, as not all Sysco warehouses are within an easy distance of a Kroger distribution center, and vice versa. Also, the employees are not obligated to work for Kroger, but the opportunity is there if they are so inclined. And as far as payment is concerned, pay to employees will still be coming through Sysco, even as workers are under the Kroger banner. So they'll clock in, they'll go to work for Kroger, but their paychecks will still be coming from Sysco. This is a positive, generally speaking, for the workers, as they would be eligible for the same benefits they were already receiving through Sysco prior to the furlough. So it's essentially a streamlined work environment. And while you're working and doing maybe a different job function, and your job description might be a little different, working in a Kroger distribution center, everything else stays virtually the same. The agreement is set to last at least 30 days, but could be extended on the needs of both companies. This is really a win-win-win, as Kroger gets employees with distribution center experience. Cisco gets a way to pay those employees and keep them happy, and the employees retain pay and benefits during this time, helping their families and loved ones make it through this rough period. This is part of Kroger continuing to ramp up employment as they have been seeking to add another 20,000 on top of the 23,500 they just added in terms of their overall employee base. They've been big in the news as far as wanting to ramp up employment at their stores. And one thing about Kroger here recently, Trent, we've been talking about it for the past couple of quarters, with those earnings announcements comes a sense of care for their employees. More and more you see reinvestment with Kroger and their employees. We're talking about not only pay and benefits, but we're talking about training and looking at how all of those different things combine into a worker that wants to stay with the company for a longer period of time. And not to mention the positive PR that's put out by all of these initiatives. Whenever somebody is happy about where they work, they let their friends know. They tell stories on social media, and all of this adds up. And you can really attribute that to maybe some increased brand equity long-term for Kroger. Side note, too, from Kroger, as this flew under the radar a little bit, Lucky's Market auctioned off a total of 23 stores for roughly $29 million. As far as the furloughs and fashion retail are concerned, they seem to be far flung, even from retailers who weren't doing poorly prior to the virus. Macy's said that they would furlough the majority of their 130,000 employees. I was actually reading an article before recording this podcast about what that is truly going to mean for the company and those workers. In fact, Macy's essentially was saying that they're going to use the absolute minimum of employees to run the business, and those are going to be the only employees that are going to be left active going forward for at least this period of time. Neiman Marcus also said that their number was going to be around 14,000. Gap's furloughs will affect its store employees primarily. They had 129,000 employees at the end of last year, but many still work in fulfillment centers for e-commerce. And Trent, you're going to speak on this, but Kohl's has announced that they're furloughing some of their staff, but did note that their CEO, Michelle Goss, was not to be taking a salary for the time being.
Goss joins a few other CEOs. A lot of CEOs out there said they would take half pay or quarter pay. Impressive that Goss is just saying, hey, I'm not taking a salary for the time being. It's not fair for me to take a salary while we're furloughing staff. The nice thing about Kohl's, and they were one of the more transparent companies as far as the furlough is concerned, any staff that's furloughed will receive existing health benefits. Certainly a small silver lining there. You have other companies, we'll talk about one in a second, that are not extending those health benefits. By the way, Kohl's is implementing or re-implementing buy online, pickup in store starting later this week on April 2nd. I found this interesting because this is really the first sign of a retailer going to a bit more retail or a bit more availability than what they had. So April 2nd, customers will be able to pick up online orders from 11 a.m. to 7 p.m. local time at most locations. So re-implementing the buy online, pickup in stores, opening the stores for those purposes. Also, they're suspending share repurchases and evaluating its dividend program in addition to drawing down its $1 billion in revolving credit. So it's obviously not what shareholders want to see, but Kohl's' priority here, very obviously trying to keep as many employees in the mix as possible. Ascena's announcement was similar. Employees will keep health benefits while they're on furlough. We didn't get an exact number from Ascena, but Gary Muto, their CEO, will take a 50% pay cut. They've also implemented measures in their e-commerce fulfillment centers to keep employees at a 6-foot distance. Some fulfillment centers, if you've ever been in a fulfillment center or a distribution center, some are easier than others to implement this in. The way I understand it is that Ascena's distribution centers and fulfillment centers, they had employees and employee stations a little bit closer, so they're spreading them out a little bit. There are some companies for whom I've been in their fulfillment or distribution centers, and it would be very easy to have an employee work an entire shift where they don't come within 20 feet of another employee, but not the case there at Ascena as they make adjustments. And of course, we have to mention Hobby Lobby. You know, we talked about GameStop and the negative PR they received last week. Hobby Lobby, of course, they went so far as to say it is in the hands of God, and that is a direct quote from one of their internal releases. and they were open in most locations, in fact, until late last week, despite widespread calls to close stores. In fact, there are still locations, we are told, of course, privately held companies, so it's more difficult to get details out of them, but there are still locations where they are lobbying to be an essential retailer, likely due to the educational aspect of some of their arts and crafts. I'm guessing that's what their argument is around. But they've also, in the last week, laid off many of their employees with no severance or insurance. And of course, we know they don't have paid sick leave for the part-time employees. Apparently, most of the layoffs happened via email, which wasn't a great look, but can be excused somewhat since the stores were closed. But it's kind of odd to lay off your corporate location employees through an email there. The email to some employees, which was leaked on social media, and I quote, "This layoff is permanent, and I encourage you to file for state unemployment benefits," end quote. Now, some people may also be saying, hey, it's important for them to be laid off completely and for that messaging to be there that it's permanent, because otherwise they wouldn't be eligible for state unemployment benefits. Well, at this point, most states have actually opened up unemployment benefits to those who are underemployed as well, or on furlough as well. So that doesn't hold quite as much water as it would in most times. The email that was leaked then continued to say that someone would be sent to this employee's home or the employee's homes to pick up their equipment and badge. And the email ended with, and I quote once again, "My prayers are with you and your family," end quote. Now, many people remarked facetiously on social media that perhaps the laid off employees didn't pray hard enough. But in reality, for a company to lay off so many people on a permanent basis, and again, we're not just talking about store employees, we're talking about front office personnel, we're talking about personnel in the creative and marketing departments there. That speaks to the fact that for Hobby Lobby, there's going to be a very long road back, if they ever get back to the same sales and productivity. Now, I don't know that the PR hit they've taken during the last week is going to affect them quite as much as it would affect other retailers, because I think a lot of their target audience is probably not seeing this negative PR. A lot of their target audience, let's face it, probably not a ton on websites like Twitter, for example. And when you take into account the fact that these layoffs were across the board and very clear that they were permanent, you wonder how many of those employees, especially the ones who felt that it was a bit unceremonious, are going to be coming back to Hobby Lobby. And you wonder if Michaels isn't over there seeing all of this unfold in real time and saying, hey, if we can hold on to more of our employees, that's going to give us an enormous leg up. Joanne, same thing, going to give us an enormous leg up when things get back going. Now, you wonder if maybe landlords are going to see it in their heart to take it easy on Hobby Lobby in the near future. I'm going to give you a hint. No, they're not going to do that. We've seen, in fact, a number of mall landlords say that they are not giving any breaks in terms of rent for retailers there. Certainly not going to be the case with those external big box landlords. I don't think that they're going to, for example, prey on it and agree to charge Hobby Lobby a lesser price. So we'll see kind of how it unfolds with Hobby Lobby, but right now, not a good look for the company. And when you're talking permanent layoffs, especially at the corporate level and not just furloughs, usually means something a little bit more severe is afoot. Well, we wanted to wrap up the news portion of the show by talking a little bit about smaller retailers. We talked last week about how the virus may affect smaller retailers, especially as it pertains to entrepreneurial influx in the brick and mortar space in particular. Well, a lot of questions remain about how the CARES Act would assist smaller retailers after the CARES Act was signed into law just prior to the weekend. So we wanted to talk a little bit about these provisions and where some of the smaller retailers, those retailers with 1, 2, 3, maybe even 5 or 6 shops that are out there, might be able to benefit. It's interesting because a lot has been pushed onto local banks as far as carrying out provisions of the act as it pertains to small businesses, and it all starts with the SBA. Now, I'm going to go over just a brief 30,000-foot view of what this does. There's a couple of different ways you can take advantage of it if you're a small retail business. There's a business interruption loan, and overall, these are targeted at smaller retailers with 500 or fewer employees. So I mentioned AMP Variety Store on last week's show. They would certainly qualify under this. Leighton, you and I do a lot of traveling, a lot of different places where You go to downtown areas or nice seaside locations, there's a lot of boutiques, there's a lot of one-off shops. Those shops are going to qualify for something like this. Now, the way it works is you take your payroll overall, and the amount of your payroll on average per month for the 12 months prior to when the loan is made, it was multiplied by 2.5 times, and that's the maximum you're able to take out. So keep in mind that this is a formula that's going to take the last year into account. Now, the whole design of this is to try and keep as many people on payroll as possible. And in fact, the covered loan, the proceeds can be used for a number of different things. In fact, they say, hey, payroll costs, group healthcare benefits, employee salaries, mortgage payments, rent, utilities, interest on any debt obligations. But here is the key. Loans may be forgiven up to the sum of these costs incurred. And furthermore, payments made during the covered period, which is February 15th to June 30th, so quite a long period of time, that go towards payroll costs, interest on certain mortgage obligations, rent, and utility payments, those are actually all forgivable. If there is a reduction in the number of full-time equivalent employees during the covered period, your loan forgiveness may be reduced. So again, an incentive for people to try and keep as many employees on staff as possible. Here's the kicker. No collateral and no personal guarantee are required for the covered loan here, so the business interruption loan. So that's huge because earlier provisions coming from the SBA and being funneled through states included the requirement of a personal guarantee, which was turning off a lot of small business owners, at least the ones that I was talking to. If you didn't want to take the business interruption loan, you can also get an employee retention credit. So you'd be permitted to claim a 50% credit of wages paid up to $10,000 per employee. Now, this is only available if your operations were fully or partially affected by a COVID-19 related shutdown order. There's a few more facets to that as well. So it's an either or. You can get tax relief or you can decide for the business interruption loan one way or another. Now, there are other tax related things, and I don't want to bore everyone to death here, but certainly this does seem like an effective way to keep those small businesses afloat. The problem is the way it's administered, and this may not be a problem. This may be a feature rather than a bug, but basically how it's administered is through SBA certified banks. So banks that give out small business loans or administer small business loans, those are the banks that are going to be responsible for receiving the applications for this program. Now, the applications haven't even been made yet by the Small Business Administration, and talking to some personnel at banks over the weekend and then during the course of today, you're looking at maybe later this week into the early part of next week before those applications are even created, and then maybe another 2 to 3 week lag in terms of paper processes and the like. Even if they are digital processes, you're still going to have those processing lags. So a lot of these businesses aren't going to be able to see the benefit from this. You're likely looking at about a month before it comes down the pike. But again, Leighton, as many smaller businesses, non-chain retailers, as we visit, you feel like this at least gives some sort of light at the end of the tunnel for them.
Yeah, to me, it certainly does. And I don't want to speak too long about this, Trent. I know that you're more intimately aware of what's going on and the regulations that are going to be coming down the pike and the different sort of funds that are going to be made available for small businesses and the businesses that potentially have been most impacted by this. But I'll speak just anecdotally from what I've witnessed. A lot of different QSRs and FSRs have been struggling. And I think, honestly, it's all about the foot traffic. Even if you're going to have to-go orders, your revenue is going to be at least cut by 50 or 60%. And a lot of retailers, a lot of service providers in retail and a lot of restaurants, of course, did not have the pre-existing infrastructure to have curbside pickup or to go. And they didn't also have maybe e-commerce optionality either. So maybe they didn't even have a good mobile site. So a lot of these retailers are those that have chosen to lay off workers almost immediately. And I think that's going to be maybe a long-term detriment to, we talk about real estate often on this show, but those regional shopping centers where you see most of their tenant base are those mom and pop shops that have really built up a grassroots foundation of customer base over the years, and this can just wipe away several years worth of profitability within a matter of months. But I think having a very smart way to spread out these funds, this $2.1 or $2.2 trillion total fiscal package that is going to trickle down to a lot of small businesses. I think that's extremely important, but it's most important as to how you implement it, and that it's has the proper amount of oversight to make sure the money gets down to those underlying employees, those employees that were part of the service sector that's been hit the hardest. And I think that's the most important thing out of all of this. Obviously, the business needs taken care of as well, but the money needs to trickle down to those employees that had been working for years at these establishments that are no longer there, that are out of work, and they need some help more than just the baseline unemployment that they're to get for 3 to 6 months. So I think it's extremely important that, and then also you have to think about some of those larger companies. We talked about several companies looking at the broader picture here, Trent. During this podcast, we talked about Macy's and JCPenney. How are those companies going to come back after all of this and really restart their business? You think about all of the operational aspects that these companies have to go through, from turning back on lights even. There's steps in everything. And then to re-onboard the employees that have been furloughed, some employees have been laid off. How does that process work? And how are you going to do it in such a way where you're not alienating your most important asset in your employees, especially those employees that are tenured, that have been working, let's say, at Macy's for 25, 30 years? You want to make them feel like they are being taken care of, and that if this happens again, they will not have a memory that is maybe negative, that has maybe not the best reflection on your actions during this most important time.
And I do want to give credit where credit's due. Jackson Kelly, the law firm, broken down a lot of that CARES Act as it relates to small businesses. They're a law firm that specializes in helping small businesses out. That was from an article, or a lot of the insights were from an article from Robert Tweel and Joshua Claiborne, so certainly want to give them credit. But to your point, Leighton, there's a lot of unanswered questions, and veering off the small business path, we were just talking about Hobby Lobby, but other businesses that lay off employees, you're also talking about service time as it relates to things like vesting in the 401k plan, as it relates to benefits. Maybe if an employee had been at a company for 20 years and gets laid off, well, maybe they had vacation saved up, or maybe they were getting a certain amount of vacation every year, and maybe they go back down to zero here. So those questions have to be asked of those companies, and certainly of those HR departments as well.
As always, we may have a position in or against companies we discuss on the podcast. Do not invest in stocks solely on the input of the podcast hosts.
We're going to close out today's show by taking a look ahead at a story we're keeping an eye on for the next week, month, or year. And no, it's not when is this all ending. We would love for retail to go back to normal, certainly, but not before. Of course, it would be healthy for all people involved. But basically, we're going to look at this question in this segment this week. Will this event, will the coronavirus or COVID-19 or the quarantining or the stay-at-home orders and so forth, will it change consumer tastes and attitudes surrounding retail? There's a lot to digest here, because we talked about people changing their cooking habits and that they're staying home, obviously, and cooking a lot more. Will that change their habits in grocery? People aren't able to go to fashion retailers. Does this change where they get clothes? Do they switch that up? And Leighton, what are some of your takeaways as far as whether or not we could see a permanent change in consumer tastes?
It's such a great question, Trent, and I think it's such a great topic to end on, because I think this is the primary thing that a lot of people in both the retail and commercial real estate industry are wondering. Is this one-time event going to change the attitudes and the long-term memory of your consumer base? And I think the answer is maybe, because right now we can see that during an event like this sort of black swan event, that a lot of things are happening that are outside of the normal ways of consumerism, the things that people would do ordinarily would not be to buy maybe 3 or 4 years worth of paper products for your home. But if you think about that in the larger sense of what happens if something like this were to happen again, maybe not as big or maybe not even a virus, but something similar to where people have to stay at home, you tend to think about the repercussions of that sort of mentality of I need to stock up on X amount of items on all of these different items for the next 3 months, 5 months, 3 years. So you don't necessarily know what goes through the consumer's mind, but we do have sort of a glimpse of it because of this. So a lot of people buying and stocking up on things, it's a very interesting thing because you have the sense of immediate gratification. People want to be able to go to their local Costco and get whatever they want in whatever amounts they want. Meaning that for some of those categories that we talk about most, especially with the Costcos and the Sam's Clubs and the BJs of the world, we talk about groceries and paper products, not necessarily hard lines anymore with those particular retailers. You can't just get things on Amazon instantly in that amount of quantity. You just can't. And no matter if they have 1 hour shipping, 2 hour shipping, it just cannot happen. But what you can do, typically, for most Americans, is drive 8 or 9 minutes down the road, stock up on those things, and bring them back for safekeeping. Again, it may be entirely too long, and it may be maybe a little bit irresponsible from the consumer aspect to do that, but they can do that. And I think that's an important caveat here. Additionally, and I'll end on this trend as far as my looking ahead is concerned, I'm going to draw back to commercial real estate investment because a lot of people were ragging on regional shopping centers that had maybe a grocery store as an anchor, whether it's maybe a national credit tenant like a Kroger in there, or maybe it's a regional grocer with only a presence in a handful of states there as maybe the anchor tenant for a period of time. But I think that a lot of people were undervaluing those particular shopping centers, and it didn't necessarily matter where they were. They could have been in a city with a population of 3 million. It could have been in a city with a population of 50,000. A lot of people, a lot of investors, a lot of the investor sentiment was negative because they looked at those shopping centers as mostly being predicated on the idea that those grocery anchors, if they leave, it's going to be very difficult to backfill those spaces. But I think people are looking at those a little bit differently now and thinking, well, you know what? In times like this, or maybe even times like this, maybe something not as dramatic, those grocery stores, again, it could be a regional grocery store, they have a place in the market that is very, very important because of the variety that they carry, and it draws back to that instant gratification, especially in those retail marketplaces where there may only be 40 or 50,000 people, and the people may not be that well acquainted with those online platforms that can, in fact, deliver the same exact goods as you're getting inside the store. But they're seeing those things, they're seeing the variety in person immediately, and I think that's extremely valuable. Not only that, most regional shopping centers that have a grocery anchor typically have things that are Amazon proof and, let's say, COVID-19 proof, where you're looking at a lot of retailers like a coffee shop that is set up to sustain something like this because, after all, people still need to eat and drink and get the normal supplies they have to have for their families in order to live and sustain a good, healthy life. Additionally, you may look at maybe those regional shopping centers and say, well, but they still have nail salons and barbershops that aren't necessities necessarily for something like this. But I think overall, you're looking at the thesis that's kind of turned on its head from those investors that would really scoff at the idea of a long-term investment that's going to be stable for these types of commercial real estate centers.
You look at some of the other co-tenants as well, companies like PetSense, for example, who's owned by Tractor Supply Company. They're obviously something that's a little bit COVID-proof, they're recession-proof, etc. So maybe a little bit more resistant there. I think those are good points. I'm really curious to see, and I'm sure we'll have Danny Cushion from Cardlytics on the show at some point in the future, but exactly how data analysts treat this point in time, because we talk so much about data, and if you're not collecting data, then what are you doing as a retailer and so forth. Yet you have all of this customer data that you've been working so hard to cultivate, and you've hit a period of time, which may go 3-4 months, where suddenly, a customer that is known for purchasing thing X is known for purchasing 3 years worth of paper towels, as you said, Leighton. So I think from a data perspective, it's interesting. The actual question as far as consumer tastes and attitudes, I think what we're seeing here certainly goes to show that consumer tastes and attitudes are still not pushed as much towards e-commerce as you would believe if you just read mainstream media outlets about brick and mortar retail dying, about all of these department stores struggling. Yet, if this were the case, the brick and mortar.coms would be seeing a lot of traffic, and instead you're just seeing a complete fall off in a lot of apparel sales for most retailers, and that's because people either don't want to go online to do it, they don't know how to go online, don't feel comfortable going online to do it, or it's just not top of mind right now when money is tight. So I think you're going to look at tastes, again, shifting towards those off-price retailers in apparel when things come out. I do think it's valid to ask if those general merchandise retailers are going to grab a bit of those apparel sales as well. But I also think, Leighton, you're correct. I think who benefits? Those people that do the bulk sales, because I think a lot of people don't believe that COVID-19, it's a once-in-a-lifetime thing. I think there are people out there that believe that this is going to happen with some regularity. So you're going to start seeing people purchase items in bulk. Those warehouse clubs that you spoke of, those are going to benefit. And the early returns, at least from general merchandise retailers, from grocers, they're getting a really good idea of what people might be pushed toward. And I really like the Kroger mindset of pushing food as an overall wellness product. It's not just something that we need, that we're required to ingest. If we eat well, there's a good chance it's going to parlay itself into overall health. Now, there's always, the man who and that type of thing as far as, hey, well, it might not always work. But again, the matter remains, if you're Kroger, again, more attention than ever is being paid to your HBA section, to your pharmacy, and to your stores in general because of that peace of mind that Leighton was talking about, because of that security that Leighton was talking about, and also the fact that Amazon, let's face it, they are running behind on a lot of key items in terms of keeping those in stock. So the average Kroger or Albertsons or Publix or Walmart, they have a chance now to parlay that additional consumer traffic, and it might not be as frequent, but the ticket size is much larger. They have a chance to parlay that attention into something big over the next few years, saying, hey, make an investment in your overall health. You might be in a better position to survive something like this if you eat well and you eat with intent. And I think that's the main thing that people are going to start driving home. With that, I think you are going to start to see a little bit more attention paid to gourmet food, especially raw foodstuffs, as it pertains to people cooking in their houses. That's at least just my take as far as looking ahead. Well, that'll do it for this week's podcast. Again, we've got an interview lined up for this coming weekend. Excited about that, and have a few coronavirus-related or really retail change-up related interviews coming in the early part of April as well. A big thanks to all of you for listening. Check us out once again on Twitter and Instagram at Retail Podcast, and we'll be back approximately 1 week from now.
This has been the Retail Focus Podcast. For more, visit our website at retailfocuspodcast.com and subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher. Follow us on Twitter at Retail Podcast.